The amber diamond on the threat display sat at 2 o'clock low, 31 nautical miles out, pulsing with the steady rhythm of a Fansong tracking radar. Captain Dave Chainsaw Stefanik watched it shift from search to track in under 4 seconds. His harm targeting system, the HTS pod, bolted to the right intake hardpoint, had already classified the emitter, SA-6. The thing had just gone from background noise to a firing solution, and the crew running it probably felt clever for waiting this long to light up. They weren't clever enough. Stefanik's F-16CJ carried 2 AGM-88 HARMs on stations 3 and 7, each one a 1,000-pound argument against turning on a radar in contested airspace. The high-speed anti-radiation missile did exactly what the name promised. It rode an electromagnetic beam back to its source at Mach 2, give or take, and converted whatever sat at the origin point into shrapnel and secondary fires. The SA-6 crew had options. They could keep radiating and guide their missiles toward the strike package Stefanik's flight covered. They could shut down and go dark, hoping the geometry broke in their favor. They could relocate, which took the better part of an hour for a full SA-6 battery and its associated vehicles. Or they could do what most crews eventually tried, some combination of all three, sequenced badly under pressure. Stefanik gave them about 12 seconds to pick. The HTS pod fed range, bearing, and signal characteristics directly into the HARM seeker head. He designated. The weapon came off the rail with a kick that nudged the jet left, and 300 pounds of blast fragmentation warhead accelerated toward a radar antenna operated by men who had just made a binary choice, radiate or die, without understanding that the F-16CJ had removed the gap between those two options. This story goes deep into the engineering and tactics that made Iraqi air defenses functionally suicidal every time they powered up. If you want the rest of it, hit subscribe and like so the algorithm does its job. And if you served in a SEAD squadron or know someone who did, drop it in the comments. The HARM covered 31 miles in roughly 50 seconds. Somewhere in that interval, the SA-6 radar blinked off. The operators had finally checked their threat warning equipment, or a spotter called in the launch, or simple self-preservation kicked in. Didn't matter. The AGM-88's seeker had a memory. Early variants struggled with this. A radar that shut down could spoof a HARM into flying ballistic and missing by hundreds of meters. The version Stefanik carried, the AGM-88 Charlie, held the last known position in onboard memory and guided to those coordinates even after the signal vanished. Shutting down bought you nothing except a quiet final 30 seconds. The missile struck the antenna van at roughly 0740 local time on the 4th day of Operation Southern Watch Enforcement, February 1993. Post-strike imagery confirmed the van destroyed, the radar dish shredded into aluminum ribbons across a 50-meter radius. 2 support vehicles burned. The crew, sources, conflict on the number, either 4 or 6 operators, did not survive. One detail from the bomb damage assessment stands out as interesting but irrelevant to the tactical story. The blast scattered a stack of papers later identified as maintenance logs, several pages landing intact over 200 meters from the impact point. Someone had been keeping meticulous records of uptime and calibration schedules, professional work by a crew that did everything right except exist in the same battle space as an F-16CJ. At Al Udeid, the debrief took 40 minutes. Stefanik's flight lead noted the engagement timeline, detection to impact under 70 seconds from a standoff distance that kept the flight outside the SA-6's maximum engagement envelope of roughly 24 kilometers. The SA-6 never launched. Its operators went from cold and hidden to radiating to dead without putting a single missile in the air. This ratio, 0 shots fired by the defender, 100% kill rate by the attacker, repeated across southern and northern Iraq throughout the 90s with a consistency that stopped surprising anyone by 1995. The F-16CJ and its HARM inventory had created a problem that no amount of Soviet-era training doctrine could solve. Iraqi air defense commanders faced a pure dilemma with no correct answer. Turn on your radar and a HARM finds you. Leave it off and the strike package walks through your sector untouched. Relocate, and you're exposed on open roads for an hour while A-10s and F-15Es own the sky above you. Every option fed into the same kill chain. Understanding how requires going back to a program the Air Force nearly canceled in 1972, championed by a group of pilots the Pentagon considered expendable and the enemy considered the most dangerous men in the sky. Coalition aircraft flew over 116,000 sorties during Desert Storm. The common narrative says those sorties annihilated Iraqi air defenses. The common narrative is wrong. Iraq entered the 1991 war with one of the densest integrated air defense networks on Earth. Roughly 16,000 surface-to-air missiles, over 7,000 anti-aircraft artillery pieces, and hundreds of early warning and fire control radars linked through a French-built command architecture called KARI. Coalition planners knew the network's topology because they'd helped build parts of it during the Iran-Iraq War. They hit command nodes first. Tomahawks struck the KARI switching centers in Baghdad at 0300 on January 17th. And, within 48 hours, the centralized network functionally collapsed. Iraqi SAM batteries lost their queuing data, their sector assignments, their ability to coordinate fire across overlapping engagement zones. The spine broke. The limbs kept twitching. And twitching limbs still kill. Post-war assessments, declassified through the late 90s and into the 2000s, paint a picture the victory parades skipped over. Coalition strikes destroyed roughly 30% of Iraq's SAM launchers. 30%. The Gulf War Air Power Survey, published in 1993, uses the phrase operationally degraded rather than destroyed when describing the overall network. Their word, not mine. Individual SA-2, SA-3, and SA-6 batteries retain the ability to engage autonomously using their organic radars. They just couldn't coordinate. A retired Iraqi air defense officer interviewed by the Conflict Records Research Center described the post-Kari environment this way. We could see, we could shoot, we could not talk to each other. The difference between a blind network and a deaf one is the difference between safe airspace and a graveyard. A blind network is safe to fly through. A deaf network, one where individual batteries still function but can't share tracking data, remains lethal at the local level. Coalition pilots discovered this the hard way. The Air Force lost 14 fixed-wing aircraft to ground fire during Desert Storm. The Navy lost 6. Several shootdowns came from SAM batteries that intelligence had assessed as suppressed. An F-16 from the 363rd Tactical Fighter Wing took an SA-3 hit on the 27th day of the air campaign, over a site that had absorbed 2 separate HARM strikes in the preceding week. The crew had replaced the damaged antenna with a spare, repositioned the battery 400 meters east into a date palm grove, and re-engaged. The smell of burned kerosene and molten aluminum hung in the wreckage for days, according to the recovery team that reached the crash site after the ground war. So, the no-fly zones inherited a problem that Desert Storm created but did not solve. Operation Northern Watch, above the 36th parallel, and Operation Southern Watch below the 32nd covered airspace defended by crews who had survived 6 weeks of the most intense aerial bombardment since World War II. They learned from it. Iraqi SAM operators adapted their doctrine throughout the 90s. Shorter radiation times, frequent relocation, decoy emitters built from commercial microwave components that cost less than $100 apiece. By 1998, American SEAD crews reported that average Iraqi radar emission times had dropped from over 40 seconds during Desert Storm to under 8. 8 seconds to detect, classify, target, and engage before the signal vanished. The clock Stefanik worked against started ticking faster every year. Jack Donovan strapped into an F-105F Thunderchief at Korat Royal Thai Air Force Base in November 1965 and flew directly at a North Vietnamese SA-2 site. On purpose. The mission profile read like a typo: locate active SAM radars by letting them shoot at you, then kill the radar before it killed you. First in, last out. The Air Force called it Project Wild Weasel. The pilots called it various things unprintable in official correspondence. The concept emerged from desperation. North Vietnam's SA-2 guideline missiles had started dropping American strike aircraft over Hanoi in the summer of '65, and the Air Force had no dedicated counter. Jamming pods existed, but performed poorly. Route planning around known sites worked until the Vietnamese moved their batteries overnight. Someone at Tactical Air Command, the records don't identify who proposed it first, suggested a dedicated hunter-killer aircraft that would fly ahead of the strike package, provoke SAM radars into transmitting, and destroy them with ordnance guided by the radar's own emissions. The idea attracted exactly the kind of pilot who considered a 50% first-tour survival rate acceptable odds. Early Wild Weasel crews in Vietnam flew two-seat F-105Fs loaded with AGM-45 Shrike missiles, primitive anti-radiation weapons with a range of roughly 10 miles, which meant you had to fly inside the SA-2's engagement envelope to shoot. The SAM could reach out to about 17 miles. The Shrike could reach 10. You do that math, and the 7-mile gap is where Weasel crews earned their reputation. They closed that gap at 500 knots, 50 feet off the deck, watching their radar warning receivers light up like slot machines. The electronic warfare officer in the back seat, the Bear, interpreted the signals and called the threat, while the pilot kept the jet below the SA-2's minimum guidance altitude. If the sight launched, you had roughly 6 seconds to acquire the smoke trail visually and break into the missile. Missed the visual, and you died at Mach 3. 45 Wild Weasel crewmen died over North Vietnam between 1965 and 1973. Their squadron motto, YGBSM, standing for You Gotta Be Shitting Me, reportedly originated from the first EWO briefed on the mission concept. The tactics evolved from suicidal to merely insane over those 8 years. Every iteration became part of the doctrine that F-16CJ pilots carried into Iraqi airspace 2 decades later. A retired Weasel pilot from the 35th Tactical Fighter Wing put it simply at a reunion in 1989. The Shrike made them nervous. The standard ARM made them careful. The HARM is going to make them quit. He had the engineering to back it up. The AGM-88 HARM entered service in 1985, carrying 25 years of anti-radiation missile failures in its design DNA. The Shrike needed the radar transmitting continuously to guide. The AGM-78 standard ARM improved range, but weighed over 1,300 pounds and limited the aircraft to 2 rounds. Both weapons required the pilot to point the aircraft's nose roughly toward the emitter, hold steady through the threat envelope, and pray the operator didn't shut down mid-flight. The HARM solved every one of those problems simultaneously. Range: over 30 nautical miles. Speed: Mach 2+, depending on launch altitude and profile. Weight: under 800 pounds, meaning an F-16 could carry 2 and still maneuver. Launch modes: 3, each one more irritating to a SAM operator than the last. The first mode, pre-briefed, let the pilot program known coordinates before takeoff. The HARM flew to a point in space and searched for emissions matching a specific radar type. If it found one, it killed it. If it didn't, it self-destructed. The second mode, target of opportunity, used the aircraft's onboard sensors to identify and prioritize threats in real time. Pilot picked one from the display, squeezed the pickle button, missile did the rest. The third mode turned the weapon into something closer to a landmine with a rocket motor. Loft the HARM to high altitude on a ballistic arc over a suspected defense zone. The seeker activated at apogee and scanned a massive footprint below. Any radar matching the threat library caught a 1,000-pound greeting from directly overhead. The operator never saw a launch warning because the missile approached vertically. The loft mode meant an Iraqi SAM crew couldn't know whether a HARM already hung above them, circling in its terminal search pattern, waiting for 3 seconds of emission to complete a firing solution. That uncertainty, the possibility of a missile in the air mid-search, seconds from impact, changed operator behavior more than any explicit threat. You don't need to kill every radar. You need every radar operator to believe he might already be dead. Texas Instruments built the seeker head around a broadband spiral antenna that covered a frequency range wide enough to engage virtually every Soviet export radar in the Iraqi inventory. SA-2 fan song, SA-3 low blow, SA-6 straight flush. The early warning radars feeding them, spoon rest, flat face, squat eye. One missile type threatened the entire electromagnetic architecture of Iraqi air defense, from search to track to engagement. A declassified Air Combat Command assessment from 1994 describes this capability as providing full-spectrum threat suppression. Polite language for a weapon that made an entire military specialization functionally suicidal. The SA-6 Gainful carried its missiles on a tracked transporter erector launcher that could relocate, set up, achieve firing readiness, and displace again in 15 minutes flat. 3 missiles per TEL, each one a solid fuel rocket with a 25-kilogram fragmentation warhead and a proximity fuse tuned to detonate within 5 meters of the target. The system killed Israeli F-4 Phantoms over the Suez Canal in October 1973, 14 on the first day alone, according to Israeli Air Force records declassified in 2004. Egyptian and Syrian crews operating those batteries had trained at Soviet air defense schools in Odessa and outside Moscow, courses lasting up to 18 months. Iraq sent its best officers to the same programs. The training pipeline produced operators who understood electromagnetic theory at a level most American enlisted radar technicians would have respected. Iraqi air defense officers attended the Kalinin Higher Military Command School through the 1980s in cohorts of 15 to 20 per year. They studied countermeasures, frequency management, and coordinated battery defense against SEAD aircraft. Plus, the doctrinal framework tying all of it together. A captured Iraqi training manual recovered during Desert Storm, translated and archived at the Foreign Military Studies Office at Fort Leavenworth, dedicated an entire chapter to defeating anti-radiation missiles. The manual instructed operators to shut down the main radar, activate a low-power auxiliary emitter offset from the battery position by at least 200 meters, and wait for the incoming ARM to commit to the decoy signal before relighting the primary set. Crude by American standards, effective enough to waste a $300,000 HARM on a repurposed police radar unit duct-taped to a wooden pole. Iraq's officer corps also carried combat experience that no training school could replicate. The Iran-Iraq War ran 8 years. Iranian F-14. Tomcats flew combat air patrols over the front lines, and Iranian F-5s conducted ground attack missions into Iraqi-held territory from 1980 through 1988. Iraqi SAM crews engaged those aircraft regularly. Some shot down Iranian jets and watched friends die to Iranian bombs in the same week. Others rebuilt damaged equipment with improvised parts because Soviet resupply schedules operated on Moscow's timeline, not Baghdad's. A crew that has repaired a straight flush radar antenna using aluminum sheeting stripped from a commercial bus, and this happened at least twice according to post-war debriefs, understands its equipment at a molecular level. Dust storms taught them which components failed first. Night operations taught them what thermal signature their generators threw. They could estimate harm time of flight based on the launch aircraft's altitude and distance, because they'd practiced the calculation until it became instinct. None of this made them invincible. The American technological edge remained enormous, and the HARM's capabilities created a problem Iraqi doctrine never fully solved. But the gap between what Americans assumed about Iraqi competence and what Iraqi crews actually delivered narrowed considerably after Desert Storm. Survivors of that campaign internalized its lessons with a sharpness born of mortal stakes. By the mid-90s, DIA assessments noted that Iraqi air defense crews in the southern no-fly zone had adopted emission control practices comparable to those taught at Warsaw Pact advanced courses. An analyst at Prince Sultan Air Base described the situation to visiting congressional staffers in 1997. "We're not flying against conscripts down there. We're flying against veterans who've been shot at by the best Air Force in the world and lived to adjust." At Al Jaber Air Base in Kuwait, the ops tempo never stopped. F-16CJs from the 77th Fighter Squadron launched into southern Iraqi airspace on rotation schedules that blurred weeks into a single unbroken patrol. Operation Southern Watch ran from 1992 to 2003, 11 years of enforcing a no-fly zone that Baghdad never accepted and never stopped testing. The mission briefings carried a peculiar rhythm. Fly north, watch the threat display. Wait for someone on the ground to make a career-ending decision. The Iraqi strategy after Desert Storm centered on a mission control so disciplined it bordered on paranoia. SAM batteries repositioned constantly, hauling their equipment along Highway 8 and the network of service roads threading through the marshlands south of Nasiriyah. They kept their radars cold. An SA-6 straight flush radar broadcasting in search mode announced its position to every HARM-equipped aircraft within 40 miles, and the crews understood the math with painful clarity. So they sat. Generators idling, missiles loaded, crews sweating through 50-degree heat inside vehicles designed for Russian winters. Fingers near the transmit switch, but never on it. The game required the Americans to fly close enough that an Iraqi battery commander felt simultaneously threatened enough to shoot and confident enough to survive the exchange. Most days, nobody blinked. The F-16CJs orbited at medium altitude, HARMs on the rails, the AN/ASQ-213 HARM targeting system painting a picture of electromagnetic silence across 100 miles of desert. Silence that meant nothing. A battery could light up, launch, and shut down in under 12 seconds. The straight flush needed 8 seconds of track time to generate a firing solution. The HARM needed 3 seconds of emission to complete its own. Whoever flinched first defined the engagement, and the margins lived in single-digit seconds on both sides. The F-16CJ carried a piece of equipment that tilted those margins decisively. The HTS pod, mounted where the left engine intake pylon met the fuselage, functioned as a passive radar detection system that could geolocate emitters without broadcasting a single watt of energy itself. Lockheed Martin built it as a replacement for the two-seat Weasel concept. Instead of a bear in the back seat interpreting raw signal data, the HTS processed threat emissions through onboard algorithms and displayed them as targeting-grade coordinates on the pilot's multifunction display. One pilot, one seat, full SEAD capability. The pod tracked emitters across a broad frequency band and maintained a contact file that updated in real time as signals appeared, moved, or vanished. An Iraqi radar that transmitted for 4 seconds and shut down still left a position fix accurate enough to cue a HARM in pre-briefed mode. The crew on the ground thought they'd been fast. The HTS disagreed. A declassified Air Combat Command Tactics bulletin from 1999 notes that HTS-equipped F-16CJs achieved targeting-grade geolocation on emitters broadcasting for as few as 2 seconds in optimal conditions. 2 seconds of transmission bought an Iraqi crew a missile they'd never see coming, arriving minutes or hours after they believed the threat had passed. This created a psychological architecture that no amount of training could fully defeat. Iraqi battery commanders faced a choice with no clean outcome: transmit and risk immediate destruction. Stay silent and allow American aircraft to operate with impunity directly overhead, which meant failing their mission, which meant answering to a command structure where professional failure carried consequences beyond reassignment. Some commanders split the difference. They'd transmit in short bursts, 2 or 3 seconds, then displace immediately, driving their TELs off the prepared position and relocating a kilometer south before the HARM could arrive. Smart, exhausting over months and years of repetition, and increasingly futile as HTS software updates refined the pod's ability to correlate fragmentary emissions into coherent track files. A battery that popped up for 2 seconds near Talil on Tuesday and 2 seconds near Az Samawa on Thursday started building a pattern in American intelligence databases: movement corridors, preferred terrain, displacement timing, and route selection. The 77th's intelligence officer could brief a patrol on likely SAM positions with enough fidelity that pilots flew their orbits weighted towards specific grid squares, not because a radar transmitted that morning, but because the accumulated pattern predicted where one might. An irrelevant detail worth noting. At least one Iraqi SAM site in the Basra area maintained a small vegetable garden adjacent to its revetment through the late 90s. Satellite imagery confirmed tomato plants. Sources conflict on whether they also grew cucumbers. The cumulative effect of HTS, HARM, and relentless patrol coverage meant Iraqi air defense operated in a state of permanent suppression without the Americans firing a shot on most days. The threat alone, silent and invisible, endlessly patient, accomplished what earlier doctrine assumed required kinetic destruction. Stefanik's generation of Weasel pilots had spent years refining exactly this. No military in history has performed well when both options lead to failure. The Iraqi integrated air defense system after 1991 faced exactly this binary, and every adaptation they attempted only confirmed how completely the Americans had closed the trap. The math destroyed them. A straight flush radar needed 8 seconds of continuous emission to guide an SA-6 from launch to the point where its onboard seeker took over terminal guidance. The HTS pod needed 2. That left 6 seconds of exposure after the harm already had a fix. 6 seconds during which the Iraqi crew accomplished nothing except confirming their own position to a missile traveling at Mach 2. At 30 nautical miles, a harm covered the distance in roughly 45 seconds. The crew had less than a minute to fire, confirm guidance handoff, shut down, and physically drive their TEL off the prepared position. 45 seconds to do 4 things that each required trained coordination between multiple operators. You can drill that sequence until your crew executes it in their sleep. You cannot compress the physics of a tracked vehicle accelerating from a standing start on soft desert terrain. The TEL moved at maybe 25 kilometers per hour cross-country. In 45 seconds, that's 300 meters. The harm's warhead threw fragments across a lethal radius larger than that. In Baghdad, the Air Defense Command, Quwat al-Dafa al-Jawi, issued updated tactical directives at least 3 times between 1993 and 1998. Each revision emphasized shorter transmission windows. The 1996 directive reportedly mandated a maximum radar emission time of 5 seconds per engagement attempt. 5 seconds fell short of the 8 the straight flush required for a complete firing solution. The directive essentially ordered crews to attempt engagements they could not complete. A DIA summary of captured documents describes this as a doctrinal contradiction that degraded operational confidence at the battery level. The DIA's phrasing pulled directly from the summary. Some crews tried optical tracking as an alternative. The SA-6 system included a television optical tracker that could guide missiles without any radar emission at all. Zero electromagnetic signature. Invisible to HTS, invisible to HARM. The problem: optical tracking required clear weather, daylight, and a visual acquisition range that topped out around 12 kilometers against a fighter-sized target. American SEAD patrols flew at medium altitude, often above scattered cloud layers, frequently at night. The optical tracker turned a sophisticated weapon system into an expensive pair of binoculars pointed at overcast sky. Iraqi crews in the southern zone attempted optical engagements on at least 4 occasions between 1996 and 2001, according to post-war analysis by the Joint Forces Command. None resulted in a missile launch. The target was never acquired long enough to generate a track. The final adaptation bordered on institutional surrender. Batteries began performing what American intelligence called false shoots, running through the entire engagement sequence with the radar in standby mode. Missiles loaded but never fired. Crews rehearsing timing and coordination against aircraft they could detect only through early warning networks and ground observer posts, relaying position reports by landline telephone. The exercises maintained crew proficiency on procedures while avoiding the emission that guaranteed destruction. They also meant Iraqi air defense had voluntarily removed itself from the fight. A SAM battery that never transmits is a SAM battery that never shoots. The most expensive scarecrow in the Tigris River Valley. Stefanik and pilots like him recognized what had happened. The suppression mission had evolved beyond destroying radars into something more efficient and far more demoralizing, convincing an entire military branch that using its primary weapon meant dying. The Iraqi crews possessed the training, the equipment, the motivation, the institutional memory of a force that had fought Iran for 8 years. What they lacked, for the first time in the history of air defense, was permission from physics itself. Over the marshlands south of An-Nasiriyah, at 14,000 feet, Stefanik's F-16CJ banked into a lazy left orbit that kept his nose pointed north and his HTS display centered on a grid square where intelligence predicted an SA-6 battery had displaced the previous night. The air smelled like rubber and sweat, and the peculiar staleness of cockpit oxygen fed through a regulator that hadn't been serviced in 6 days. His HARM hung on Station 5, the left inboard pylon, 1,361 pounds of purpose, waiting for a reason. The HTS screen showed nothing, 40 miles of electromagnetic desert. Every Iraqi radar in the southern zone sat cold, their operators locked inside the same calculation that had paralyzed them for years. Stefanik flew the orbit for 11 minutes. On the 12th, a contact bloomed at his 1 o'clock, 18 nautical miles, bearing 045. The HTS classified it in under 2 seconds. Straight flush tracking radar, 6.2 gigahertz, signal strength consistent with a main lobe oriented southeast. Oriented at him, someone down there had decided today carried different stakes. The battery commander, his name does not appear in any declassified record, made the choice that every directive from Baghdad had spent 5 years trying to prevent. The kill chain started before the Iraqi crew finished their first sweep. Stefanik's HTS had already refined the emitter's position to a circular error probable of roughly 40 meters. The system fed those coordinates directly to the HARM's inertial navigation unit through the aircraft's MIL-STD-15-53 databus. The missile's seeker head, a broadband spiral antenna housed behind a ceramic radome, began correlating inertial guidance data with the incoming radar energy. 2 independent targeting solutions converging on the same patch of Earth. The HARM didn't need the radar to stay on. It already knew where to go. If the signal continued, the seeker would ride it down with sub-10-meter accuracy. If the signal died, the inertial package would carry the missile to the last known coordinates, 40 meters of uncertainty, but the warhead's 25,000 tungsten alloy fragments covered that margin, and then some. Stefanik squeezed the pickle button at 11 seconds after initial detection. The HARM dropped off the rail, its Theocol dual-thrust rocket motor igniting 0.4 seconds later with a kick that threw exhaust across the belly of the jet. The missile accelerated through Mach 1 in under 3 seconds, climbing briefly before pitching over into a descent profile that would bring it down at a terminal angle steep enough to defeat low-altitude terrain masking. At Mach 3.4 in the terminal phase, the HARM covered the 18 nautical miles in approximately 32 seconds. The Iraqi crew had the radar on for 9 seconds when Stefanik fired. They achieved a valid track at the 8-second mark, enough to launch an SA-6. Whether they actually fired remains unclear. The post-mission intelligence summary references a possible missile launch detected on the F-16's ALR-56M radar warning receiver at 14 seconds into the engagement. But the contact faded without developing a guidance profile. If they launched, the missile went stupid when the crew shut down their radar at the 15-second mark. 6 seconds after Stefanik's HARM left the rail, they killed the signal and started their displacement drill, the one they'd rehearsed hundreds of times in false chutes, the one that required them to stow the antenna, engage the drivetrain, and move the TEL off the prepared position before impact. They had 17 seconds left. The HARM seeker had already transitioned from inertial to home on jam to pure passive homing during those 6 seconds of active emission. It stored the signal characteristics, frequency, pulse repetition interval, scan pattern, in onboard memory. When the radar went dark, the missile didn't hunt. It didn't circle. It followed the inertial solution to the coordinates the HTS had generated before the crew even knew they'd been detected, adjusting its terminal trajectory with an accuracy that made the distinction between radar on and radar off functionally irrelevant. The straight flush antenna dish measured 2.4 meters across. The harm didn't need to hit it directly. It needed to detonate within a radius where 25,000 fragments traveling at 6,000 feet per second would intersect the target. The warhead's proximity fuse triggered at an altitude of approximately 8 meters above ground level, converting the missile into an expanding cone of tungsten that shredded the antenna, the radar van, and the cabling connecting them to the TEL parked 40 meters east. Stefanik's radar warning receiver went silent at 32 seconds after Pickle. The amber diamond on his threat display flickered once and disappeared. He noted the time, 0947 local, marked the coordinates, and continued his orbit. How many times does an aircraft have to kill a radar before the Pentagon stops trying to kill the mission itself? Stefanik's engagement over An-Nasiriyah answered a question that had been grinding through Air Force budget meetings since 1991, but the people asking it kept pretending the answer hadn't arrived. The argument against dedicated SEAD platforms started gaining traction almost immediately after Desert Storm. A coalition of program officers, budget analysts, and precisely zero combat pilots pushed the position that precision-guided munitions had rendered the Wild Weasel concept redundant. Stealth aircraft could penetrate defended airspace without provoking a radar response. Standoff weapons could destroy fixed SAM sites from beyond engagement range. The F-16CJ and its HTS pod represented, in their framing, an expensive solution to a problem that modern air warfare had already solved through other means. A 1994 Internal Air Staff review recommended reducing SEAD dedicated squadrons by 40% and redistributing the airframes to multi-role units. The review described dedicated suppression as a legacy capability, optimized for a Soviet threat that no longer existed. The Southern no-fly zone demolished that thesis in real time. Stealth worked beautifully against fixed, pre-surveyed targets with known radar frequencies and predictable operating patterns. Iraqi mobile SAM batteries offered none of those courtesies. The batteries moved nightly, changed frequencies between positions, and refused to emit until the geometry favored them, or until desperation overrode discipline. An F-117 could fly through defended airspace undetected, but it carried no harm and no HTS. It couldn't suppress a threat it never saw. Standoff weapons required target coordinates generated by someone, and that someone turned out to be the SEAD aircraft the budget analysts wanted to eliminate. The entire precision strike architecture depended on a permissive electromagnetic environment that only dedicated Weasel crews could create. Pull the Weasels out of the equation, and every strike package flying north from Kuwait absorbed risk that multiplied with each sortie. The 77th Fighter Squadron's operations officer compiled sortie data between 1996 and 2001, showing that Iraqi SAM activity dropped by an average of 63% in sectors where F-16CJs maintained continuous seed orbits compared to sectors covered only by strike aircraft carrying self-defense harms. 63%. The difference between a suppressed air defense network and an active one, measured in radar activations per patrol cycle. The 1994 review's authors had confused the absence of SAM launches with the absence of a SAM threat. They looked at Southern Watch statistics showing few American aircraft lost to ground fire and concluded the threat environment had become permissive on its own. The threat environment had become permissive because F-16CJ pilots flew into it every single day, carrying weapons that made radar emission a death sentence. Remove the cause, and the effect reverses immediately. A Joint Forces Command study completed after Operation Iraqi Freedom in 2003 stated this with unusual directness for a government document. Dedicated SEAD capability remained the single most critical enabler of coalition air superiority in both no-fly zone operations and major combat operations. The study's authors bolded that conclusion. The F-16CJ squadrons survived every budget cycle from 1994 to 2003. They survived because the crews kept flying missions that produced results the spreadsheets couldn't argue with, measured not in kills, but in silence. The antenna dish lay on its side like a satellite television receiver scaled up to the size of a living room, its parabolic surface punched through with hundreds of holes no larger than a pencil eraser. Each hole represented a tungsten fragment traveling fast enough to pass through sheet aluminum without slowing down. The dish had separated from its pedestal mount at the elevation actuator, the weakest structural point, and fallen backward onto the roof of the radar van, caving in the sheet metal and crushing the waveguide assembly underneath. Scorch marks radiated outward from the van in a starburst pattern consistent with the HARM's airburst detonation profile. A Marine intelligence team photographed this site southeast of An-Nasiriyah in April 2003, cataloging it as one of 14 destroyed SA-6 positions identified in the D-Qar province alone. 14 in one province. Across southern Iraq, the physical evidence told a story the operational data only hinted at. Reconnaissance imagery collected during the opening 72 hours of Iraqi freedom revealed SA-6 and SA-3 batteries in various states of destruction, abandonment, and bizarre improvisation. Some sites showed blast damage consistent with harm strikes dating back years, craters weathered smooth, debris partially buried by seasonal dust accumulation, vegetation growing through the floor plates of gutted radar vans. Other sites appeared intact but deserted, their equipment still positioned on prepared revetments with cables connected and missiles loaded on rails. The crews had simply left, walked away from functional weapon systems because operating them meant dying faster than not operating them. If the Iraqi Air Defense Command had concentrated its surviving assets into a smaller number of heavily defended super batteries, massing SA-6s alongside SA-2s and AAA in overlapping kill zones, the calculus might have shifted. Concentration creates mutual support. It also creates a target worth spending more than one harm on. They didn't try it. A team from the 75th Exploitation Task Force documented one position near Al-Amara where an SA-6 sat on its prepared pad with 3 missiles loaded. The straight flush radar van locked and powered down, and a thick layer of undisturbed dust covering every surface. The dust accumulation suggested the equipment hadn't moved or operated in months, possibly longer. The TEL's battery compartment contained dead cells. Nobody had maintained the vehicle's electrical system. 3 missiles worth approximately $90,000 apiece pointed at empty sky from a launcher that couldn't fire them, connected to a radar that couldn't transmit, crewed by men who'd been reassigned to ground observation posts equipped with binoculars and field telephones. The 75th's report uses the word non-functional 11 times across 4 pages describing this single battery. The human cost accumulated in quieter ways. Iraqi air defense personnel captured during the 2003 invasion described years of psychological erosion to their interrogators. One battery commander from the Basra military district, a lieutenant colonel with 17 years of service, including combat against Iranian F-4s and F-14s during the Iran-Iraq War, told debriefers he had not activated his unit's tracking radar since January 2001. 26 months of commanding a weapon system he refused to turn on. He described conducting false shoots twice weekly, maintaining equipment readiness logs that reflected a unit capable of engaging targets within 90 seconds of alert, filing monthly readiness reports to Baghdad claiming operational status. The reports contained accurate information about equipment condition. They omitted the fact that his standing order to his crews prohibited radar emission under any circumstances without his personal authorization, which he never intended to give. He told his debriefers he had decided his men's lives outweighed his career. Sources conflict on whether he faced disciplinary action before the invasion rendered the question irrelevant. His battery position fell to the British 1st Armored Division on March 23, 2003, at approximately 0830 local time. The crews surrendered without firing a shot. The radar van's power switch sat in the off position. The dust on the console measured 3 millimeters thick. What replaced the harm? Something faster, longer-legged, and built on every engagement the F-16CJ crews flew over southern Iraq between 1991 and 2003. The AGM-88 GMER entered full-rate production in 2024. Extended range, Northrop Grumman won't say how much, and the specific number stays classified, but the airframe trades the HARM's cylindrical body for a design with low observable shaping and a rocket motor that nearly doubles the engagement envelope. The Seeker combines the HARM's passive anti-radiation capability with an active millimeter-wave radar terminal mode and a GPS-aided inertial navigation unit that maintains targeting accuracy even if the emitter shuts down, relocates, and sets up again at a new position. The weapon can hit a radar that turned off 6 minutes ago and moved 800 meters east. The Iraqi displacement drill, stow the antenna, drive away, pray, no longer buys survival time measured in anything useful. The engineering lineage runs straight back to Korat in 1965. Jack Donovan's F-105F carried a pilot's eyeballs and a Shrike missile with a Seeker that locked onto one frequency at a time. 60 years of iteration produced a weapon that autonomously classifies and prosecutes multiple emitter types across the full tactical radar spectrum without pilot intervention beyond consent to launch. In retrospect, the progression looks inevitable. Nobody funding it at the time thought so. Every generation of SEAD technology faced the same budget fight. The Shrike nearly lost funding in 1967. The standard ARM survived cancellation twice. The HARM program weathered a congressional review in 1980 that recommended termination based on cost per unit projections that turned out to be wildly pessimistic. The AARGM-ER's development budget drew criticism from the same institutional corners that produced the 1994 Air Staff Review. Analysts who looked at stealth penetration profiles and fifth-generation sensor fusion and concluded that dedicated anti-radiation weapons represented redundant capability. The